Everyone. Thank you all so much for attending today's webinar. I'm going to give it just maybe 10 more seconds to get people situated, comfortable, and join today's session. All right, everyone, we're going to get started here. Hi, and welcome. My name is Sabrina Ham. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at FreeFrom, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I want to say welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar on our National Survivor Financial Security Policy Map and Scorecard. I'm just going to walk through the agenda, some housekeeping items, and then we'll continue with today's presentation. So we'll have a couple housekeeping items just to let you all know some key details. We'll do an introduction to FreeFrom and our work, some discussion on understanding the problem. We'll do an overview of the policy map and scorecard, talk a little bit about some challenges as we built the tool, and then also talk about what's next, and obviously have some space and time for a Q&A for the last 10-15 minutes. All right, so a couple housekeeping items. So today's conversation and presentation slides will be made available to all those who registered. So you will, so if you registered, you'll get a recording of the webinar and also the presentation slides. And then also we're going to be using the chat function throughout today's presentation. So feel free to use that to interact with each other, and the presentation will have some prompts and some prompts for you all to interact with using the chat function. And then we'll also have the Q&A function, which will be really for you to submit any questions that you may have throughout this whole presentation. And we'll do our best to answer those either in the Q&A function, and then if not, they're certainly at the end when we open it up for question and answers. And then also, if we are unable to get to your question, we'll certainly do our best to follow up after. So before we really just dive into a bit about FreeFrom's work, we'll just do a quick poll just to see who's in the room today. So hopefully you all can see that. Just take a few seconds. We just want to know who's here, get a sense of who's registered. Are you a survivor? You work for or am elected official? You work for a government office? Are you a policy advocate? Are you a direct service provider? Is there something else that we didn't include that you all are a part of? All right, I'm seeing it coming in. So we'll give everyone just 30 seconds to answer the poll question. All right, I think that's almost everyone. All right, so we have about 20% of, or 19% of folks are survivors. We have a couple folks who work in a government office. We have majority of folks identifying as a policy advocate and a direct service provider. And then a few folks for other. And if you click other, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just making a little description in the chat so we can just sort of get a sense of who we weren't able to capture in this. All right, thank you. So we'll end the poll right now. All right, so we're moving on. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy Durance, who will introduce herself and continue with an introduction of FreeFrom.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here, and I am thrilled that you're all here as well. My name is Amy Durance. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Systems Change Initiatives here at FreeFrom. So I'm really excited to give you all a quick introduction to FreeFrom and our work before turning it back over to Sabrina to really delve into the mapping tool. Okay, so as you can see from this slide, FreeFrom's approach, we envision a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, and credit with which to build wealth and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. And you can see in the second paragraph that really our work to meet that vision, meet that goal, is really using a holistic approach. And you can see there's some of the aspects of our work. But what does this like really mean, right? Well, so at FreeFrom, really at the core of everything we do is challenging and working to transform some traditional narratives and frameworks that are applied to intimate partner violence and how our society responds to it. And so specifically what I really mean by that is that rather than treating intimate partner violence as a series of independent short-term crises, we at FreeFrom really approach the problem as a systemic economic issue. You can go on to the next slide, please. So why do we focus on financial security and the economic impacts of intimate partner violence here at FreeFrom? As you can see from this slide, still today, 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 2 trans folks experience intimate partner violence in the United States. And the #1 obstacle to safety for survivors is financial insecurity. And so this means that it is financial insecurity that's trapping survivors in danger. It also means that we're not going to be able to successfully disrupt intimate partner violence in the US until we acknowledge and address the systems and policies that create obstacles to financial security and wealth for survivors. And as you can see from this slide, it is extremely expensive to be subjected to intimate partner violence. So the CDC estimates that it costs, being subjected to intimate partner violence costs female survivors $104,000 over the course of their lifetime. So that's a significant cost. And yet we know that this is really an underestimate because it doesn't take into account the financial implications and consequences of economic abuse, which, as you can see, is experienced by 99% of survivors. You can go to the next slide. And economic abuse has its own significant cost, as you can see here. You know, we survivors in our network, we basically ask folks, help us better understand how much this is really costing you to experience economic abuse. And this is what we learned from folks in our network. The survivors in our network reported that harm doers were stealing an average of $1,280 from them each month, that they were restricted in their ability to use an additional around $1,000 of their own money as they saw fit, again, each month, that harm doers were incurring an average of almost $16,000 in coerced or fraudulent debt in their names each year. They estimated that they lost out on around $23,000 of income every year and have incurred almost $18,000 in property damage. So again, it's just extraordinarily expensive. And with the #1 reason, or the #1 obstacle to safety for survivors being financial insecurity, we have got to deal with that in order to disrupt IPV. We have got to create policies and put systems in place that remove these obstacles to survivors' financial security. Okay. Next slide. So understanding, with this understanding of the problem, what are state laws like really getting wrong right now when it comes to intimate partner violence? You can go on to the next slide. Okay, so first and foremost, states are not prioritizing survivors' financial security in their laws. So, for example, we know that 99% of survivors experience economic abuse, and yet the vast majority of states do not acknowledge that economic abuse is a part of intimate partner violence in their state's laws. So that's a huge blind spot, and we're really not able to create the resources and support for survivors that they need if we're not really identifying, acknowledging, and addressing their experience. Also, you can see here, emergency response to intimate partner violence cannot be the only solution. And unfortunately, most of our responses currently are really crisis focused. But we just went over all the costs associated with being subjected to intimate partner violence. Imagine having all those costs and then for example, you're able to stay at an emergency shelter for 30 days. But what happens when that 30 days is up? So we can't limit our responses to only crisis responses. You can also see here that services that require a survivor to leave to access support are limiting. Not only that, they really put the burden on survivors to act. Completely starting a life over is very expensive. And so, requiring that survivors take that step before they're able to get support not only puts the burden on survivors, but also what ends up happening, the effect of that is that folks have to wait until the moment of peak crisis to get support. So this means that they've already experienced a lot of that financial devastation by the time they're able to get resources. So we've got to be thinking about what are some earlier interventions rather than just waiting until that moment of peak crisis. And finally, as you can see on this slide, most survivors express that they don't want to involve police, and that involvement by the police can often be actually be harmful for survivors. So, and these, the first two stats are from a National Domestic Violence Hotline survey. 80% of survivors indicated that they were afraid to call the police in this survey, and 70% of survivors report that contact with the police resulted in a loss of housing, employment, or welfare benefits for either the survivor or their harm doer. And then finally, this is from our own survey of folks in our network, 68% of survivors said that they either can't or don't feel safe getting a police report. So involving the police in responses and support at the state level can really be counterproductive for survivors. So can anybody, are there any other limitations on current state policies or responses that folks can think of that we didn't cover on that last slide? Anything from personal experience or your own work that you've identified as significant obstacles or problems with state laws that are not really that helpful for survivors? And feel free to use the chat and I can check it out. Anything that comes to mind? Anyone? Public charge. Can you say, okay, with the income eligibility restrictions? Absolutely, that's a big one. And oftentimes when we talk about economic abuse, on paper, a survivor might seem as though they make too much money or have too many assets in order to get services, but we know because of economic abuse, the reality of that situation is a lot of times folks don't actually have real access to those funds or assets. Let's see. Okay, could you go to the previous slide so that folks can see what we've already said? Requires participation in prosecution. That's a great one. And so here, any others? Those are some really great. Documentation status. That's a really good one. Oftentimes they do require folks to present evidence of their immigration status. Thank you so much. Those are all really great, great ideas and suggestions. And so now I am going to turn it back over to Sabrina to take us away.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you for your interaction on the chat. We certainly really appreciate this. And, I'm going to go and just walk through the map and scorecard. I'm not sure if everyone has had a chance to look at it, but I'm going to share the link to the map and scorecard and just give everyone a minute to just look at the map and scorecard on their own, and just would love to hear anyone's initial thoughts and impressions after you get a chance to quickly look at the map and scorecard. And if you can't do that now, maybe you were able to look at it beforehand, and would just love to hear anyone's thoughts, impressions of the scorecard before we really dive into all of the details. Just give everyone a minute to do that. And thank you, AK, who's on our team, for sharing the link in the chat. All right. Yes, none of these states are model states. Yes, very large sad face for us on this end as well. Any other initial thoughts or impressions? Apologies for Minnesota for really not being helpful to survivors. The mapping tool is absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, so I know that folks who are living in the states where It's either little to no accountability for survivors. I like to think of it as a huge opportunity and lots of policy potential. Yes, so much, Fred. Thank you for sharing that. That there's a lot of policy potential for change, and so hopefully with this tool we're able to do that. So thank you all for sharing. I'm going to continue on with the presentation. So with our National Survivor Financial Security Policy Map and Scorecard, we had two main goals. One was to advance survivor financial security centered policies in every state. As Amy had alluded to, that just currently states are not really prioritizing survivor financial security or survivors in their state policies. And this is a huge opportunity for them to really just look at their own policies in their states and even how they compare among other states and say, how can we do better for survivors? And then secondly, engage survivors to actively participate in policy making process through easy pathways to direct attention and movement building. And so once you all have a chance to look through, you'll see that there's some really quick and easy ways for survivors and advocates and other folks to engage in the policy making process through sharing their policy ideas, contacting their legislators, which I'll get into more detail about that. And so I think one is just being able to allow for folks living in their respective states to see what are the state policies, how it's impacting them. And then if they are able to engage in some level of policy making, the policy making process, or engaging with their elected officials, or even partnering with FreeFrom's to see what changes can happen for them. And so, one of the questions that, we really like to highlight is like, why this tool? Why are we creating this? And as I mentioned before, creating a space for policy advocacy for survivors, and then also catalyzing public pressure on states to implement survivor financial security centered policies. I think other states seeing how, either their neighboring states are doing and how well they're doing or not so doing, I think that can certainly put greater public pressure on states to act. And making sure that survivors are centered in their policies. And then also creating an opportunity for resource sharing among states and advocates. I know that there are, I know I've gotten some emails of, do you know what's going on in this state? Or, have you heard of this policy that's happening in this state? And hopefully this gives a platform for folks to really interact with the tool, and then also know who are potential partners in other states where they may have passed a similar policy that they are working on and want to do the same themselves. And then filling a gap. There is no other tool like this that provides information for every state's laws as it relates to survivor financial security. So yes, this is a first of its kind tool, and we are really working to really fill in that gap so that other states and that survivors can really see what information is out there, how their state laws are impacting them. And so as we were building this tool, we really wanted to make sure that we were learning from survivors. And when we developed the criteria, when we developed the policies that you see outlined on the map and scorecard, that it's all rooted in survivors' experiences, what they've told us, what we've heard from them. And that's sort of how we came to what's on the map and scorecard. And so we know that economic abuse is prevalent and financially devastating, as Amy had alluded to in the earlier discussion, where 96% of survivors in our network reported experiencing it. So just a quick note, the next few slides about what we learned from survivors are from our two most recent reports, the Survivors Knows Best report and our Trust Survivors report, which we will share in the chat so that you all have access to it. And then we'll also share it when we send up a follow-up email as well. So thank you, AK, for sending that out. And then also survivors are 4 times more likely to experience material hardship. So that's food and housing security as an example in the past year as compared to the average American adult. And then we also learned that survivors don't have a safe way to save the money they need for safety. 48% of survivors reported that a harm doer has accessed, monitored, withdrawn from, or controlled their bank account. And so if a survivor is trying to save money to make ends meet, or to do what they need to stay safe, that if a harm doer is controlling and monitoring and depleting that it really makes it even more challenging for a survivor to do that. And then also BIPOC survivors are 3 times more likely than white survivors to report not having access to a safe bank account. And so if you layer on sort of the racial implications of that, it makes it even more challenging for survivors of color. And then we also learned that survivors need financial support and resources. So we asked survivors what are their top needs, and 35% of survivors indicated credit and debt relief as their top need, and 31% of survivors indicated safe employment as their top need. And so you'll see some of this reflected in the policies that we chose to highlight in the map and scorecard. And then we also learned that survivors don't have quote unquote proof that they've experienced harm. And 53% of survivors reported that they do not have any proof that they are a survivor. 68% of survivors can't or do not feel safe getting or sharing a police report. And 69% of survivors can't or would not feel safe getting or sharing a protective order or restraining order, which, a lot of states, in terms of accessing certain protections or access to certain exemptions from safety net programs, for example, will require a survivor to produce a police report or a protective order, when in fact over a majority of survivors don't feel safe doing that. So it creates even greater challenges for survivors to be able to access that protection or access those services if they can't or don't feel safe getting those levels of proof. And so we listed out sort of why these policy categories. We chose these based on, as I mentioned, survivors' experience. We looked at current policies, what states are doing now, and then also really just honing in on what policies are really most directly impacting a survivor's ability to build financial security. And so we have economic abuse as defined in state laws. I think it's important. We think it's important to recognize that in 99% of IPV cases, survivors are also subjected to economic abuse, and it's important to recognize that in state laws. And then paid and protected leave. Survivors need time to deal with consequences of abuse. That doesn't deplete their vacation, that doesn't deplete their sick leave. Survivors, when they are having to deal with those consequences, they are not on vacation and they're not sick, and they shouldn't have to worry about, depleting a sick day or vacation day because they need to seek services. And then safe workplace policies, so certain accommodations that employers are required so that survivors can feel safe at work. And then also access to unemployment insurance, protections against litigation abuse, a designated tort for intimate partner violence. So oftentimes, or majority of the time, survivors are left incurring all the costs associated with the harm that they've been subject to. And so allowing a survivor to be able to essentially sue a harm doer to recoup some of the costs that they had to incur because of that harm. And then the accessibility for victims of crime compensation. And then we have access to certain safety net programs, so SNAP and TANF, which a lot of states allow for survivors to have certain exemptions, such as work requirements or time limit exemptions, and making sure that those programs are accessible for survivors. And then safe banking protections. Survivors, it's more than just affordability. It's a level of protection and protection against fraud and harm doer being able to use the banking system and financial products to deplete their assets, their resources, et cetera. and then protections against coerced and fraudulent debt, rental protections, and then also alternatives to law enforcement responses, as we know that a lot of servers don't feel safe and don't feel comfortable involving law enforcement, as it creates more harm as it can create more harm for them. And so really thinking, what more can a state do to support survivors in a crisis moment that doesn't have to necessarily be with law enforcement. All right, so when you go on to a state, so you'll see, I just sort of did a quick snapshot of one of the states. I believe this is Illinois, safe workplaces. And you'll see the scorecard sort of with each category sort of split up into sort of 4 subcategories. So positive policies the state has, which is a check if they have it. And so these are the great things that they are doing to support survivors. And then adverse policies that the state has, which if they do have it, then it automatically makes that policy an adverse policy, because it could be really great, but if it really limits a survivor to be able to access that protection or those services, then it's not going to be supportive of a survivor. And then we have positive policies that a state should adopt. So if someone is going to go back and, for example, look at their safe workplace policies in their state, they can see, okay, we should add a couple more things to make it even a stronger policy. And then we also still kept, even if the state didn't have an adverse policy, we still kept that in there just in case if, for example, someone in the state wants to amend a certain policy, that they are amending it in a way that's not going to be harmful or have unintended consequences for survivors. So we wanted to make sure to highlight that. So I went through quite a bit of policy categories. I'm just going to go back to a couple of those slides so you can just quickly see some of the policy categories that we have laid out. And then I think, as we are continuing to reiterate and expand the map and scorecard and thinking about how we want to evolve it, it would be great to hear from you all, what other policy categories should we consider? What's something that is not included on the map and scorecard that we should add? And would love to hear anyone's thoughts. Just give everyone a second. So in the chat, if you have any other ideas on other policy issues, categories that we should consider adding to the next iteration of the map and scorecard. Yeah, I'll scroll back to the list. So immigrant specific protections, yes. So here is the first list. So laws across the states that are old and poorly written. So discrimination around source of income, yes, thank you. So language, justice, and cultural responsiveness, yes, thank you. These are all great, and certainly have come up in lots of our conversations. So the price of divorce, okay. Fair wages, I see that. So someone had suggested bills in current legislative sessions that are addressing these areas. I think that's a really great idea. How likely prosecutors are to pursue cases for low versus high income survivors. I think that is certainly an important thing to highlight. All right, okay. I see whether or not marital rape is legal. I see states that use and offer address confidentiality program for voting? Yes. Thank you all so much for sharing. If there's any other ideas that come up for you all, feel free to share it in the chat. And if something comes up after, feel free to email me, and I will be sure to share my contact information at the end of today's presentation. All right, so we're just gonna move on to talk a little bit about how we did it. FreeFrom, certainly appreciate all of the help and support that we were able to get to build this tool, and wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here. So as I mentioned before, we decided the policy categories based on survivors' experiences, data research, and just narrowed it down the list of policy categories. We knew that we couldn't include every single thing. And so we did our best to really focus on what is directly impacting survivors' financial security, and recognizing that in the next iteration, we'll continue to expand. And we conducted research. There's 50 states plus DC, so 51 jurisdictions across 13 different policy categories. And it required quite a bit of research, and so thankful for the 7 pro bono law firms who brought on their summer associates. We had 12 research volunteers from We the Action, which, if you're not familiar with We the Action, check it out. They have a ton of great folks that you can connect with to help volunteer on legal or law-related projects. And then deciding the criteria. So similar to deciding the policy categories, we looked at survivor experiences, research, and just developed a set of criteria for each policy. And then conducting the evaluation. So after we researched, after we sort of looked at created the criteria and decided the policy categories, we, with the help of a consultant, we evaluated each policy category across 51 districts. And then creating the design, we spent several weeks on the design, really to make sure that the information is approachable and engaging. We could have all this great ton of information, but if it's not accessible, if it's not digestible, if it's not engaging in any way, then this tool would not be, effective. And so we had someone on our team to really focus on the design. And so from the icons to the way it looks, the colors, all of the little tiny pieces of it, of the design, to really make sure that it was engaging. And then building the site. So throughout this whole entire process, from the beginning to even now, we worked with web developers at Ragtag to build and create the site. So they were the ones that really helped put our vision into this final product. And so thankful for all the folks involved. And if you have a chance, you can look at our acknowledgements page to get a list of all the pro bono law partners, the Ragtag developers, and everyone else who helped to build this project. All right, so we spent time evaluating each policy category, and we split it up into 2. So one is model, so like identified what's a model policy versus what is adverse policy characteristics. And we thought that it was important because, as I mentioned before, there are, policies out there that are the intent could be to be supporting survivors, but because of the way it's written or certain limitations, really prevent a survivor from being able to access those services or protections, etc. So we looked at survivors' experience, we got guidance and feedback, we looked at the strengths of existing policies. We had subject matter expertise regarding the intersection of financial insecurity and the experience of intimate partner violence and economic abuse, and then also a ton of data and a ton of research to really decide how we came up with the policy category and the criteria. And then we assigned each score. So with the scoring, we tried to keep it as simple and easy to understand. I think with these scorecards, there's a ton of different ways how we could score it, how we could put letter grades, how, there's almost an endless amount of ways that we did it. And so we wanted to keep it sort of as simple and as approachable as possible, especially for folks who may not have interacted with a similar, scorecard. There's lots of different kinds of scorecards or maps, interactive maps like this. And, for folks who may have never seen something like this before or never had really interacted with this, we want to make sure that it was easy to understand, approachable. And so we just kept it sort of simple in terms of the grading. So model policy is, yes, it has all of these things. A strong is if it has like the majority of them. Then promising if it has at least one or two of the model policy characteristics. And then adverse policy is even if they have some of the criteria under the model policy, that if they have any of the adverse impacts, so for example, requiring a survivor to produce a police report to access a protection or a service, that was automatically adverse because, as I mentioned before, things like that make it really hard for survivors to access those protections or services. And then no policy, as self-explanatory, the state doesn't have this policy at all. And so you'll see you can see this image on the main page of the map and scorecard, where this is just a snapshot of every state score across each of the policy categories. And as someone mentioned in the chat, there's some red for some of these policy categories, and then for some of the states as well. But there's a lot of policy potential. I think there's a lot of states who are doing such a tremendous job, and there's a lot of states who need some extra push to move in the right direction. And so you can see that for some things, a lot of states are doing well on, and then for some things, most states aren't doing so great on. So for example, economic abuse defined in state law, right now we only have one state that defines it in state laws, and we have quite a few states, for example, have a designated tort for intimate partner violence. So that's being able to sue a harm doer for the harm and damage that the survivor was subjected to. And then unfortunately, a lot of states have adverse policies when it comes to victims of crime compensation accessibility. And then we have another list here that sort of list out some of the other policy categories. And you can see that for things with safety net programs, a lot of states are doing really well on, and same with rental protections. And I think there's a handful of things that states just don't have any policies around. And I think, there's a lot of potential there for them to move the needle on that. Okay, so similar with how we decided the score for each policy category, we came up with a similar sort of framework in deciding the overall state score. And so the state score is a culmination of how they scored across all policy categories. And, I would say we were a bit generous with the scoring curve here. Model state is essentially just about a majority of the policy categories that they're doing well on, and then financial security friendly state, that they are doing well on a broad range of policies and is on its way to becoming a model state. And then we have us taking steps to becoming a survivor-friendly state. And so there's, just a handful of states, a handful of policies that are doing really well on, and, are taking those steps. And then for some accountability and little accountability, it's really states that haven't really prioritized survivor financial security in their state laws, and certainly need the greatest support in changing those laws. And then I also have just a quick snapshot, which this image is also on the main page of the scorecard, where yes, unfortunately, a lot of states, there's no model state. There's only a couple that are financial security friendly, and a handful of states that are taking steps, and a majority of states are some to little accountability. And I think folks may feel maybe disheartened by this number, but I think this just means there's a lot of potential for policy and legislative change. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges, and we had two main challenges. One was navigating states' websites. That posed the greatest challenge. As I mentioned before, we had, I think, 7 pro bono law partners, 12 legal research volunteers, and we did our absolute best to, to navigate each state's websites to figure out what the state laws that they have. And some states required a user to navigate multiple search engines to simply find a state law. I think some of the websites were just not intuitive on how to navigate, maybe like we had legal researchers, we had summer associates, we had, attorneys helping with this project, and even just having them navigate state website was certainly a challenge. And then there was also difficulty in linking directly to a state statute. I think this is, there were some challenges on being able to figure out how to link directly to a state's statute, as in our related resource section of the scorecard. And so we did our best to do that in places that we could, and in other places where we couldn't, we found a trusted third-party website to find that statute and have that as a resource. And then also some states' websites locked users out after extended period of use. That happened actually more often than not, where someone was looking at searching through the state website, and after some period of time, they weren't able to go back in and sort of had to refresh the page or delete their cookies and all that. And one thing we wanted to note, which we also noted in our methodology, that you can find on the Map and Scorecard page, is that this actually creates a level of disenfranchisement for survivors and folks living in that state, which I'm certain we can have a very long conversation about that. And just, as I mentioned, we had legal researchers, we had attorneys, and they even had a hard time navigating state websites. And so for folks who are, trained in that sort of work, that they were having a hard time, I just imagine of just folks who this is new to them, making it even more challenging for them to just know how certain states impact them, how certain policies, programs, and all that. It's, a lot of states did a really great job, and a lot of other states just didn't. And then with 51 distinct laws and jurisdictions in the US, I know it's a ton of information, a ton of content. And we recognize and understand that we may have missed a couple things, maybe missed some key details or interpreted things slightly different than the folks on the ground, or the intent of how the bill or legislation was written. And we certainly appreciate and welcome any and all feedback and corrections about the scorecard. So if you are browsing through your state or another state and you say, hey, that doesn't seem right, just send me an email, or you can do it right in the scorecard that has, there's a link that says, I think it's called report missing information. And you can do that right there, or send me an email directly. And we're going to do our best to continue to update and make sure that this website is as accurate and as informative and as engaging as possible. So if there's anything on there that you all have feedback, whether it's the accuracy of a state law, or any changes to how to make it more engaging, we welcome all of it. All right, so I'm just going to do a quick spotlight on some of the features. So we have Contact Your Legislator, which is, as it says, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about in just a second, where someone can enter their zip code, their address, and it'll pull up their elected official, and they can tweet at them, you can email them, you can call them right from the Map and Scorecard. And then we have Build Collective Survivor Power, which our next webinar, which I'll share at the end, will, the goal of this is really to create a space for survivors to really think about how they can collectively work together to build survivor power and to advocate for policies in their state. And then we have partner with FreeFrom, where if you look at this and you say, hey, let's work together on a policy, you can fill that out and I will reach out to you as soon as I get it. And then we have share your policy ideas. So if there were some policy ideas that you all wanted to share to add to what we have on the map and scorecard, as I said, we're going to continue to reiterate and expand the scorecard and appreciate your feedback and ideas. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about this is my favorite feature. So if you go onto Contact Your Legislator page, you can find it at the end of the main page and then also at the end of each state page under Take Action. So this will come up and then someone can enter their zip code or their full address. And if they enter their zip code, their elected official. So if it's just a zip code, then it's their governor and lieutenant governor. But if they enter a full and complete address, then it'll be the elected officials in their district. So for California, it will be the senator and the assembly member. And then there's a little script there that they can, if they feel like they want to call and leave a message, they can email them, they can Facebook them, and then also tweet at them. So if you go back and click the tweet, then a pre-populated tweet will come up with a link to the map and scorecard for someone to tweet. And so hopefully this will give survivors and users just a really simple and easy way for them to engage in the policymaking process. If they don't have a ton of time to be walking the halls or, calling in or, helping to, build a coalition around a certain issue, like there's really simple and easy ways for survivors and users to be engaged in the policymaking process. Okay, so we have impact to date. So we've had over 1,400 users, which is very exciting, and over 4,000 site views. Most visited state pages are California, New York, and Texas. And we have 12% of users are returning. So this is just, this tool has only been out for a couple weeks, and it's just so exciting to see that folks are using the tool and are engaging with it. And we have active user engagement, and you'll see a little screenshot of someone on our Instagram page noting that they contacted an elected official in the state of Texas. And I've gotten quite a few folks engaging on the various forums. So we have a few folks who filled out the partner with FreeFrom, and I have some follow-up conversations with them. We have survivors who are interested in building collective survivor power. And so it's really exciting to see that folks are engaging, and really appreciate all of that. All right, so what's next, which you all might be thinking is, we will continue to regularly update and expand the map and scorecard. We're going to work with survivors and advocates to pass survivor financial security centered policies in every state. So that's where the partner with FreeFrom and build collective survivor power form comes in. And then also, we have a really large goal of creating survivor-led policy coalitions in every state. We really want to make sure that survivors are as involved in the policymaking process as they can be, and getting to that point, I think building state survivor-led policy coalitions in every state can really get us there. So we are almost out of time. So I think that I will just quickly share this question, and if you all want to answer, but I won't go through the answers. I won't take up too much time going through the answers. So if folks, after listening to this, we would love to hear, how will you or your organization use this tool? Is it self-educating? Is it connecting with FreeFrom? Is it, contacting the legislator? Like, whatever it is, we'd love to hear it. Okay, I'm not really, I'm seeing a couple things, but I'll just move on so that we can have time for Q&A. So we are, okay, so I see target services to fill in the gaps, things like that. So feel free to continue entering your answers in the chat. I'm going to move on so that we have time for Q&A. I'm so sorry, y'all. We had a lot to cover. So thank you all so much for continuing to engage. So we're going to have another webinar really for survivors, building collective survivor power through policy advocacy change. And this is really for survivors who are interested in learning about how they can get involved in policy change through working with FreeFrom, and then also through the map and scorecard. So the registration link is down there, and we'll also send this up in the follow-up email. So I'm going to open it up. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function or in the chat. So we can take questions and we'll do our best to answer all of them. If we don't get to them, then we'll try to follow up after. So you can see Amy and I's contact information down here. So if you want to follow up with us, feel free. Our email addresses are also on our website. So feel free to connect with us. So any questions, comments, anything like that. I know I went over a ton of things. I'm sure y'all are tired of hearing me talk, but
well, and also, Sabrina, I wanted to just highlight, I've been kind of answering some questions as they come in the Q&A while you were chatting, while you're presenting. Yeah. And some folks have some really amazing suggestions for, some ideas on how we might be able to expand the tool in the future or create a more nuanced, detailed look. So, for example, some folks have been talking about, is there a way to perhaps capture local laws within cities that might be doing a better job of protecting survivors living within the city limits than the larger state that they're in. And I think that's a really wonderful idea, because I think that those laws and policies obviously are very impactful on survivors' lives. So really appreciate that, those thoughts. And also, folks were asking things like, are there certain policies that no states have adopted? Are there other policies that seem to be adopted more widely and consistently? And so I thought my response, Sabrina, was to really point this individual into the direction of that landing page for the map and scorecard. Do you mind actually, I think it could be helpful if you can, to sort of just pull it up, or even pull up that one image you had in the slideshow. And I think that this piece on the landing page is a really great way to get a glance right here. At a glance, you can sort of see, oh, okay, look, let's take a look. It looks like, a lot of states are having a designated tort, or at least more than some other policies. But wait a minute, there's a lot of adverse policies happening here in the victims of crime compensation. So this is like a really great place to get a quick view of the landscape, so that you could say, oh, okay, well, let me figure out what these great policies look like, or let me figure out what's wrong with these policies in this category. I think this is a really great place to start. And I'm going to speak for Sabrina, but I know that I know that either of us are always just tickled pink, just thrilled to chat with folks about policy change, especially when it comes to centering survivors' financial security and prioritizing survivor wealth. So if you're using this map and you're like, okay, I kind of get it, but I have some follow-up questions, I have a very specific nuanced questions, please do not hesitate to reach out and email either or both of us. We'd love to hop on a call on a Zoom and chat with you in more detail. And not only that, Sabrina highlighted, and I hope and really encourage everyone on the call to do it, is to really submit in that, do you want to partner with FreeFrom on policy? Because guess what? We want to partner with you. And so, please, if you just are interested in what that would look like and just want to have an initial conversation, fill that form out and then we'll get in touch. And as Sabrina said so beautifully, so many times during this presentation, there is a lot of red, there is a lot of pink. It is, upsetting, and also that sort of hurt that we feel for states not really doing as much as they ought to. That also represents just an extraordinary opportunity for us as advocates to work together to really help support states as they move toward being really responsible and taking accountability for folks that are living in their borders. So.
Right. Well, thank you for that, Amy, and for monitoring the Q&A. We have just a couple more minutes, so folks can either ask a question, maybe share additional comments, feedback, maybe some of the questions that we asked throughout this presentation. You have some additional thoughts, feel free to share that now. And again, if something comes up after today's presentation, feel free to email us. AK from our teams included Amy and I's email in the chat, so that's there for you all. And then also we'll be sure to include it in our follow-up email as well. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to give it one more minute. I know maybe it takes a minute for folks to maybe type out their question or think about it, but I'm just going to give everyone one more minute, a couple more minutes if they have any questions or comments or any last minute things that they want to share. All right.
I have one question came through. Any ideas on how to start policy or work with safe banking protection? Yes, absolutely. We have, as Sabrina mentioned, a full policy category that's about safe banking protections, understanding that the majority of survivors, or almost half, I should say, of survivors indicate that they don't have access to a safe way to save money in a safe and protected bank account. And we have sort of policy characteristics within that policy category of safe bank protections. We have listed out things that states and advocates should consider as far as what sort of policies could be implemented at the state level that would really better protect survivors when they bank. So we would love to talk to you about that in more detail offline. Please feel free to reach out. But also you can take a look at the map, and if you go under in any particular state that safe banking protections category, you can see we've made a list. It should include this. So you can see very clearly what we're suggesting as far as a great place to start to better protect survivors when they bank.
Yeah, and then I think another thing to add is that there has been a lot of work on elder financial exploitation, and some states have really good laws specifically for elders, and I think potentially seeing if there's movement on there in your state around that could also set a really strong precedent for including safe banking practices and protections for survivors in your state.
That's a great point.
All right, any more questions? Anything else? All right, thank you all so incredibly much. We will be sure to send out all of this information in a follow-up email. And thank you all for engaging with us and for interacting with us today. And again, reach out to us if you want to partner, if you have any more questions, thoughts, feedback, whatever it is, we welcome it. Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your week.